Hello, my name is Max Richards, and I'd like to introduce you to one of my favorite bands, the Beatles. They are very influential and have positively influenced my life and the lives of many in the world because they changed the world. John, Paul, George, and Ringo changed the world, and I'll explain how through their albums chronologically. Their first album, Please Please Me, was an album written because their recording studio Parlophone asked for it after they heard the 3 singles that the Beatles had produced. And the Beatles had already been playing at the Cavern Club a lot, so there you go. The Beatles recorded 10 songs in 12 hours for Please Please Me, and this propelled them into Beatlemania. With the Beatles was the next album. This album was not quite the monumentous feat that the 10 songs in 12 hours Please Please Me was, but they were cemented as professionals because they were playing live gigs and still recording their album. A Hard Day's Night was the next album, and it was a soundtrack for the first Beatles movie. This soundtrack was very applicable because the title itself tells you that the Beatles were doing all they could just to, get better. They finished filming the movie, played 3 concerts, did a TV special around the Beatles and a radio special from Us to You, and then went on vacation. For a week in April, the top 5 on the Billboard's singles chart was all Beatles albums. Now, the next album was called Beatles for Sale, and this album was a shift in tone for the Beatles. Not too much, but the Beatles went from more pop to a bluesier, darker, grown-up sound. They played 40 shows between August and October, and they recorded that in that time. One such appearance on television was The Ed Sullivan Show, and a major inspiration for this album was Bob Dylan. Help was the next venture the Beatles made. This was a movie as well as the soundtrack, and the Beatles, while writing and recording this, were on marijuana the whole time. George Martin was impressed with their songwriting fertility, and McCartney found inspiration for writing his 2-year-old song Yesterday when they went on a 4-day trip to the Royal Albert Hall to watch Bob Dylan play his final solo acoustic gigs. The next album, Rubber Soul. This album was a huge shift tonally for the Beatles. They went from bluesy pop to more love songs. The Beatles were very progressive for pop music and themselves, really. This is the first album that the Beatles got full control in the studio, and they spent way more time on the songs so they could have a more precise album. They finished the movie earlier in the year and were touring while recording Rubber Soul in the span of 4 weeks in October and November. The next album is Revolver. Revolver was a psychedelic experimental album that the Beatles learned and were inspired from LSD. Revolver was made during a 4-month lull with nothing booked for the Beatles. The Beatles just searched for inspiration for their new album, Together and Alone. Harrison found inspiration in Indian music, McCartney found it in art galleries and traveling, and Lennon took LSD in his house. The Beatlemania was long past since the Beatles quit touring on August 29th, 1966, after this was released, hating the old mop-top Beatles look. Next album is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. My personal favorite album by the Beatles, and the unquestionably most influential album that the Beatles produced. This was definitely influenced by psychedelics, and not everybody was happy about that. The hippie counterculture was happy that they produced an album like this, and the idea behind Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was to make an album behind the veil of somebody else so that there wasn't expectations. The Magical Mystery Tour was the third Beatles movie. The movie itself was a flop, but the soundtrack achieved what the movie could not. The successful single Strawberry Fields Forever was written before Sgt. Pepper's, and the soundtrack for Yellow Submarine and Sgt. Pepper's was written simultaneously with Magical Mystery Tour. Brian Epstein, longtime manager, died during this time of recording. The Beatles' White Album was the next album that they made. This album was basically 4 individual artists making an album together because the Beatles were not in unity anymore. They did not have a good time, and they were often finding the studio uncomfortable because this is the first time that Lennon had Yoko Ono in the studio with him all the time. The next was Yellow Submarine. Now, Yellow Submarine was a animated movie that the Beatles had very little to do with in the making, and they just kind of knew about it after they were told to make a soundtrack for it. There was only 4 original songs that they made for it, so it wasn't super new or anything, but the 4 originals were made by Harrison, McCartney, and Lennon, and they were impressed with the movie, so they wanted to be in the final scene. Now, Abbey Road was the next album. Abbey Road was supposed to be a way for the Beatles to return to their roots and get back to the Abbey Road studios with George Martin to kind of go back and reinvigorate their Beatles songwriting. But it wasn't to be because John Lennon had been playing with Plastic Ono Band and found more inspiration musically and freedom with them. The next and final album is Let It Be. Let It Be was a film as well as an album, and the Beatles recorded Let It Be all while they were recording Abbey Road. They took a break during the summer of '69 to focus on Abbey Road, and unsatisfied with the album, they had someone new put it together, and his name was Phil Spector. Phil Spector put together the Instant Karma album for the Plastic Ono Band, and ultimately none of the Beatles were happy with this album. In conclusion, there you have it. The Beatles were a very influential band. They changed the world, and they changed me, and I'm sure they might have changed you. The Beatles were completely unmatched in terms of change and progression in their music, and the Beatles were extremely successful. Thank you for watching.